So what I want to do is to stress the complexity of the issues involved. Most people, we are all populists nowadays to some extent. Most people will think that you have an easy answer to the question creation or evolution. And my aim is to offer an antidote to this populist simplicity. And that's, of course, the target of Studium Generale, as Melanie explained to us, and to show how very complex this issue is when you think more deeply about it. And in particular, I'd like to stress 5 different dimensions of this question, evolution or creation. Most of my religious friends, whom I sometimes ask questions like this, what do you think about evolution or creation? They will immediately answer, well, this is not a problem for us at all. Because the text of Genesis, so of the Old Testament, where the creation stories are told, in fact 2 different creation stories, is just a myth. We should interpret this story not literally, but just as some kind of interesting myth, which shows us how important the world is for our Creator. But of course it's not a story we should take as a historical account of facts. Now, it's interesting, my first dimension is a historical dimension. It's interesting to see when this interpretation of the Bible arose. Because when we look to intellectual history, and we look more in particular to the interpretation of the Bible, we see a very long tradition of literal interpretation of the Genesis stories. And what people try to do is very interesting. They try to calculate the precise date of the creation. They didn't make a difference between the creation of man or the earth or the universe usually, but they try to calculate very precisely the date of the creation by adding up the chronologies in the Old Testament. You can read how old all these people were and so on and so on. You can calculate that. And interestingly, when you do that, you will meet many, many difficult problems, both of textual interpretation and of mathematics. Now, let me quote one of the first famous authors who did this work, so the chronology of the Old Testament in order to find out when everything was created. I wrote it down. This is Theophilus of Antioch, who published in the year Anno Domini 191 a book called Ad Articulum, which is he was a friend of his, Ad Articulum, so it's meant to be a present to his friend. And he there calculates that the earth was created 5,698 years before the date he published his book. Now, you will say this is a very long time ago, this is not very interesting, but when you go to the 17th century, the century of the scientific revolution, we see that doing biblical chronology was a subject of research that was very, very fashionable. And we find hundreds of books that try to calculate how old the creation is by doing the chronology of the Old Testament. Now, there are many difficulties here. Let me just point to 2 of them. One is mathematical, that's quite complex, the calculation of times. And there were other difficulties of biblical interpretation. What shall we do with people in the Old Testament, in Genesis, who live more than 900 years? Should we suppose, for instance, that a year at that time lasted much shorter than it lasts now, so that this is a realistic estimate of the age of these people? And then, of course, people had to dive deeply into astronomy in order to see whether the time calculus was still valid and so on. Another problem that they had to tackle was a text in Psalms 90, verses 4, which says that for 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday. So the idea is that for God, 1,000 years count just as one day. Now, if you apply that to biblical chronology, you have very difficult calculations. Now, in the early 17th century, more than 300 books were published on this issue, and the most famous one certainly was published by James Ussher, a very learned book published in 1656. Archbishop of Armagh, the Annales Vetris Testamenti, published in 1650 in fact, and he claims that creation began at Saturday 23rd of October 4004 BC. Now, so I think that the history of science is a very interesting approach. When did we really think that biblical interpretation had to yield to science? And of course, as soon as we come to the second topic, so my first topic is history of science, the second dimension of this whole question is biblical interpretation. How do we do that? Then we see that interpreters of the Bible, when biblical texts seem to be in conflict with scientific discoveries, in fact have only three options. And all these three options are quite difficult to accept for them, at least when they think that the Bible is a religious revelation of some kind. The first option is to say, well, the Bible is right and science is wrong. Many people, even now in the United States, think so, that if there is a conflict between biblical texts and science, then the biblical text, as it is God's revelation, of course, has precedence. Now, of course, in a university such as ours, very few people will accept that view. Another option for a biblical interpretation is to say, well, the Bible is simply false. But that, of course, is difficult to accept for believers. The third option, which is the most popular one, is that we accommodate the interpretation of the Bible to new scientific results. And that's what most theologians, of course, are doing. But that's not very easy to accept for the believer either, because then it is science that sets the agenda for the reinterpretation of divine revelations. And that's very strange, because, of course, the authority of God should be more important than the authority of human discoveries. Now, so there are interesting issues of biblical interpretation. That's my second dimension of the creation or evolution story. The third dimension is more my own field, epistemology. So we should wonder, what are the reasons why we are believing that the theory of evolution is a very, very probable theory? As you all know, these reasons come from very, very different biological domains, such as morphology, or our fossil reservoir, or genetics, or what is called biodiversity in different regions of the world, so the distribution of species. And it is quite clear, and I have explained that during my lectures, that from all these different domains of biology we get very, very strong inductive reasons to believe that the theory of evolution is correct. There's one philosopher, Karl Popper, who didn't know very much about biology, and he thought that the theory of evolution is not a really scientific theory because it doesn't have predictions that can be falsified. You will recognize Popper's philosophy, but that clearly is completely wrong. If in the fossil archives we would find an animal such as a rabbit in a very, very old geological stratum, the theory of evolution would be clearly falsified. So it is a real scientific theory that you can falsify, and it never has been falsified. So we have epistemology. Why do we believe in a theory of evolution? Why do we believe in biblical stories if we believe in them? What is the way in which receiving revelations is a cognitive process that can be validated? Can it be validated at all? All these questions are my third dimension. Now, most enlightened Christian believers will say, well, don't talk about Darwin. Of course, we believe that the Darwinist story is correct. The species, different species, are not created separately by God, but at least God is responsible for the creation of the universe. And as you will know, there was one Pope, Pius XII, who thought that the theory of the Big Bang gave a magnificent inductive support to the story of creation. And in 1950 he gave a speech called Una Ora, in which he claimed that cosmology now confirmed the creation story. So then we don't talk about the evolution versus creation, but the origin of the universe might be due to creation. Now that's a fourth dimension. So if we have to discuss that one, we have to dive deeply into cosmology. We have to wonder whether it makes sense to say that Big Bang has been caused by something, and we get all kinds of philosophical and cosmological discussions. I can't say more about that because time is up. So my last dimension is that I think that if we think about evolution and creation, the believer has some kind of decision tree to go through. So how do you interpret your own religious belief if you are a religious believer? And there are a lot of decisions to take. The first one is when you claim that, for instance, God exists. Is that a truth claim, or does it merely express emotions or values or whatever? So that's one decision you have to take. If it is a truth claim, you have a second decision to take. For instance, can you believe that a truth claim that God exists or something is true without giving any evidence or arguments for that claim? That's one option. Or do you have to give arguments and evidence? That's the other option. Now, if you take that second option, then you have a new choice to make. So it's a complex decision tree. Are the arguments and evidence for your belief, your religious belief, are they similar in logical structure and in evidential criteria to the arguments scientists give for their scientific theories, or are they very, very different arguments? Now, you see that all these options are defended by philosophers of religion, so that again, what I want to stress is how complex this whole issue of evolution and or creation is. And I hope that if you are interested in the issue, that you will come to Studium Generale and to follow the lectures of biologists and of theologians who interpret the Bible in order to be more instructed into the real depth of these issues that for most people can be answered in 1 second.